Welcome to Farm Year Daily, a field forward podcast. I'm David Geiger. Today on Farm Year Daily, June was warm and wet. We're going to talk about weather patterns and what could be ahead with Iowa's state climatologist, Justin Glisan. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast as well as our social media at Field Forward Pod. We would love to have you join our community, keeping folks informed about what is affecting our farmers. This is Farm Year Daily. And joining us on Farm Year Daily, we have the state climatologist of Iowa back on the program, Dr. Justin Glisan. Justin, always good to chat with you, especially after the month of June that we had, and I want to dig into that. So first off, hope you're doing well, and secondly, what are some of the key takeaways for June?
Yeah, hey David, nice to be back with you. So it's always a pleasure to talk with you. Yeah, June, wettest month for the northern two-thirds of the state climatologically. We stuck to that theme during June. You look at parts of northern and getting into western and central Iowa in the top 25 wettest Junes on record. So widespread rainfall across the state. Some severe weather, though below that climatological threshold for what we expect. Our top month for tornadoes, we only had 5 in weak tornadoes at that. So that's always good news when you have thunderstorms and rainfall that don't meet that severe threshold. Now, we did have some straight line wind and hail events that caused some crop damage. Not widespread, but if you're a farmer and it's your field, it's very impactful. But overall, you look across the state, anywhere from 108% of normal all the way up to approaching 200% of normal in that north central part of the state. Overall, the statewide average was about 3/4 of an inch above normal. So on the precipitation side, just what we needed. We see drought conditions being improved across the state and also seeing some drought and abnormal dryness removed from the state. On the temperature side, we were about 2.5 degrees above average. These again are preliminary numbers. We're still working on the quality controlled numbers for June, but looking like near the top 25th warmest as well. So you look overall, the general feel for June was a warm and wetter month for the state.
I think back to the start of June, the first half, which was pretty dry, which then obviously turned around completely the second half. And I recall talking to folks in around central Iowa, and that to mean north, south, east, west, not central Iowa itself, because it seems there was relatively normal rainfall in the middle, but then around the state there was pretty intense rainfall for a pretty large portion of the state. Is that hold true, or was it spread out pretty evenly across the state?
You know, when we get into thunderstorm-driven rainfall in the growing season, it's the haves and the have-nots in terms of where that rain falls. Our trends have been for higher intensity events more often, but on a smaller spatial scale, particularly in May and June, and even getting into July. So you do see portions of the state, particularly northern and western Iowa, is where we saw much of the rainfall during the first half of the month. Then we started to see that behavior go back and forth across the state. So we did see more rainfall in eastern and southern Iowa as we got into the second half of June. But if you look at where we saw the least amount of rainfall, still above average, it is in portions of eastern and south central into southeastern Iowa.
Really, that's kind of surprising because I was talking to folks over in northern Iowa and over for a field day in the northern part of the state. Actually ran through a couple thunderstorms on my way there. Clouds so low you could just about touch them from your car. And they were talking about an hour where they had about 4 inches of rain, which seems incredible.
Yes. So again, those higher intensity events, we're seeing those more often. And you can get, with the amount of moisture that we have in the upper Midwest, the Gulf is open, flow off of the Gulf into the upper Midwest. Looking at soil moisture profiles across the southern states, very wet. And they've seen a lot of severe weather and the catastrophic events in Texas just over the last week. tons of rainfall, so saturated soil profiles. Why that's important for the upper Midwest is when that flow comes off the Gulf, we have drier conditions in the southern states. That moisture is pulled out of the air mass, and that's where you think of 2020 through 2024. We see a lack of moisture, particularly during May, June, and July. And that's where we see drought conditions expand and intensify. Well, with the very wet conditions across the southern states, that moisture is able to get further north. And that's where we see a lot of water vapor availability in the atmosphere. And when you have a trigger mechanism, a thunderstorm to feed off that moisture that's in the atmosphere, an anomalously large amount of moisture, that's where you can get into these higher intensity events over 1, 2, 3 hours, in which you see rainfalls that you would see typically 2 to 3 weeks in a month. So we had some stations across the state that had, in these events over June, anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of rainfall over 24, 48 hours. So again, that's what the trend is pushing us towards, these higher intensity events.
So the top in the top 25 wettest Junes, in the top 25 warmest Junes, but only about 5 tornadoes, I believe you mentioned. That seems like a pretty low number. Is that typical for being both wet and warm in Iowa? And did we see much other severe weather that can produce catastrophic results?
We had 111 wind reports. So if you look at the Storm Prediction Center's storm reporting system, whenever the general public or law enforcement or the National Weather Service receives a report of severe winds, for example, producing damage, those are given to the Storm Prediction Center. So not widespread severe weather, but we had all the ingredients, but at different times and at different levels. So you need moisture, lift, and instability to get severe thunderstorms. We had enough moisture, we had enough lift, forcing mechanisms to produce thunderstorms. Not a lot of wind shear in the environment, so you don't get a lot of tornadoes. But what you do get are more hail and high wind reports, and we did see those in June. Now, last year around this time, we were approaching 130 tornadoes and a lot of hail events and a lot of straight line to wind events. Last year was the highest severe weather. We had the most severe weather last year in the observational record. This year we've been well below average. The first May since 2010 in which we didn't have a tornado reported across the state. So it's nice to see thunderstorms. It's nice to see rainfall below that severe threshold. We get enough rainfall to start chipping away at drought and abnormal dryness, but also as vegetative and atmospheric demand increases through the growing season, these timely rainfalls replenish soil profiles, but also increase stream flows. And that's where we start to see a convergence towards wetter conditions and improvement in drought.
Remind me, how much rain in excess of the average did we get for June?
Statewide, you look about 3/4 of an inch. Now, if you look at the climate divisions across the state, and we have 9 climate divisions, and to orient the listeners, Climate Division 1 is Northwest Iowa, Climate Division 5 is Central Iowa, and Climate Division 9 is Southeastern Iowa. So they're basically boxes across the state. For the highest amounts of above average rainfall, we had a deviation in north central Iowa, which is Climate Division 2, over 3 inches above average. And then you look at eastern Iowa, Climate Division 6, only 3/100ths above average, so right near normal. So that was the span across the state that we saw in terms of above average totals. But definitely, you look at that north central part of the state, that's where we saw the highest totals for the month.
I was actually talking to ISU extension agronomist in eastern central Iowa, and they were talking about how it's been just about perfect. They've been in just this right nook where they're getting just the right amount of rain. And I'd like to then talk about what our soil moisture profile is looking like and then what our aquifers are looking like. Because in topsoil, we're now more surplus across the state than we are short to very short. That's not the same case for subsoil. But what is that picture looking like, and what does that mean for the aquifers?
Yep. So with the rainfall that we've seen through June and late May and getting into July, we do see surplus in topsoil because that's the most shallow part of the soil profile. Looking deeper down across the state, we're generally in the middle of the percentiles where we want to be, basically 30 to 70th percentile. So you take 100 years of data. If you're way too wet, you're in the 99th percentile. If you're way too dry, you're in the top fifth percentile. So we'd like to see soil conditions in that 30th to 70th percentile. And that's where we are for much of the state in terms of the profile going down basically to 80 inches. Now, we do see some semblance of drier soils where we do have D1 conditions on the drought monitor. So that would be in southwestern Iowa, a little pocket in south central near Ottumwa, and then a little bit of D1 up in northwestern Iowa. So these are where we see lower stream flows through June, but also drier soil profiles. Now, when we're talking about the aquifers, again, for your listeners, we're just coming off of a 4-year drought, which was busted last year at the end of May with the 9th wettest start to a year. Those aquifers, for 4 years of drought, those aquifers lose a lot of water. So it takes, 5, 10, 15 years to get fully replenished in these deeper aquifers. But with the amount of rainfall that we've seen across the state, that has really helped replenish shallow well fields. We see this reflected in stream flows, but also in our aquifers as well. But we're going to need several more years of above average rainfall to fully replenish the aquifers that were somewhat depleted during the drought years.
Hey, Justin, hold that thought. We're going to continue in just a moment, but first, let's take a look at the marketplace. And there was some mixed trade going on at the end of the Wednesday market trading session. September corn a penny and a quarter higher at $3.99 and a quarter, with December rising a penny and a quarter at $4.15 and a half. Soybeans in August 12 and a quarter cents down at $10.09, with September 11 cents weaker at $9.97 and a half. Soybean meal in August $1.30 a ton in the red at $269.40. In the wheat market, September 3/4 of a penny lower at $5.47, with December falling a penny and a quarter at $5.67 and a quarter. In the livestock market, close for Wednesday, a little bit more green there, although August live cattle were down 20 cents a hundredweight at $219.77. October up 52 cents at $217.35, with August feeder cattle $1.35 higher at $320.47, and September 85 cents more at $320.02. Lean hogs in August, 45 cents a hundredweight in the green at $107.22, with October 80 cents higher at $93.77 a hundredweight. That is the Wednesday market close. This is Farm Year Daily. We'll talk about future expectation of trends here in a moment, but I did want to zoom out a little bit since you mentioned the U.S. Drought Monitor and take a look at the Midwest and what we're seeing there, because the South is looking really good in terms of the Drought Monitor, at least the last interpretation. We'll get a new update tomorrow on Thursday as of this recording. But when you look at that Midwest trend and Midwest scene, what does that mean in the scope of climate that you're watching?
Yep. So you look at the Corn Belt in general, and we have 2 pockets of drought across the upper Midwest and the Midwest in general. You do see D1 conditions in northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin, getting over into Michigan, and a little bit in northern Indiana, so eastern Corn Belt. Then we see a big break in drought conditions across the state of Iowa and getting into much of Wisconsin and Minnesota. Almost a lack of drought and abnormal dryness in Missouri. Where we do see the highest concentration of drought is in Nebraska, D1 and D2 conditions across much of the state. And then getting into a little bit of abnormal dryness across Kansas, which over the last 5 years has been in a pretty substantial drought, D3 and some D4 conditions down that way. So you really have to go west of the Rocky Mountains to see uh, enhanced drought conditions, that D3 and D4, particularly in the Four Corners region in the desert Southwest. So we're looking pretty good across the Midwest. And with the rainfall that we've seen recently across our states, we're going to see improvement in the drought conditions on the drought monitor depiction that will be released tomorrow morning.
All right, this may be a bit of a tangent, and I normally don't like asking Google questions to experts myself, but is drought the same measurement across states? Because I know Nebraska is particularly dry; they have irrigation and stuff going on over there in comparison to Iowa. Is drought the same thing from soil profile to soil profile, or is there a direct definition to that?
Excellent question. So no, and that's why the drought monitoring process is such a complex thing to go through each week. As a state climatologist, I coordinate our recommendation to the federal authors each week, as do many states across the United States. But a drought in Florida is not the same as a drought in Iowa, and it's not the same as a drought in California. As you mentioned, there's widespread irrigation in Nebraska, so they have different agricultural impacts when they do get into drought. You look across the state of Iowa, we don't irrigate on a widespread scale here. So when we start to get into meteorological deficits, which kick off drought conditions, if those deficits continue to stack up, particularly during the growing season when we expect the most rainfall, that's where you can start to get into hydrological and agricultural impacts. And those agricultural impacts and hydrological impacts can lead into socioeconomic impacts. Thinking about in 2021, Saylorville Lake, the reservoir north of Des Moines, was approaching a particularly pervasive temperature and precipitation regime in which algae blooms were possible. And that would have been a very big problem for the Des Moines Waterworks, which serves 600,000 Iowans with drinking water. So when you're thinking about drought, it spans different thresholds for different states, depending on what is grown, depending on, like you said, soil profiles, depending on stream flows and hydrology. So I could give a presentation on 5 hours of drought just on the nuances between states and even between different regions of our state. So you look at the Iowa drought plan, we've carved out 5 different drought monitoring regions in the state based on landforms, based on geomorphology, based on hydrological outputs and meteorological inputs. And this plan was put into place about a year and a half ago to help us get a better idea of how drought is impacting various sectors across Iowa.
I really appreciate that, and just emphasizes there are no stupid questions mentality, because I found that super interesting, and it makes sense because there's so many different soil profiles that they're not going to hold water in the same way or in the same manner. So I
Absolutely.
appreciate that.
Yes.
As we look into the future here, we're a week into July. What are you looking for? What are some of the trends we're expecting for Iowa and the Midwest?
Yep. So every morning when I get to the office, I look at the 7-day forecast for what we call the quantitative precipitation forecast, or the amount of rainfall that we can expect over the next 7 days. And that 7-day forecast acts as a bridge to the 6 to 10 day and the 8 to 14 day outlooks. And those outlooks give us an idea of what we can expect if we're looking at today, getting out into the middle to third week of July. So what I'm looking at is an active forecast, an active weather pattern over much of the upper Midwest, including Iowa, the potential anywhere from 1.5 to 3 inches across the state. Right as we're getting into pollination and tasseling and corn, and as vegetative demand continues to increase. So regular rainfalls, excellent for drought, excellent for our growing crops. And now we are getting soil profiles that are starting to get soaked in certain parts of the state. So we're always cognizant of flash flood potential. Not seeing a very good signal for severe weather, which is also good to see in the next 7 days. But what I'm looking at, I looked at the initial July outlook and then the final July outlook, which was issued on June 30th. There's an interesting little bullseye across Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, and parts of southwestern Iowa that were trending drier. And that's what we've seen over the last 10 years for July's, is actually a dip in rainfalls across Iowa. So looking at this on June 30th, somewhat distressed on the potential of seeing less rainfall and warmer temperatures as we move into July. Well, we've actually been above average on rainfall for the first week, and our temperatures haven't been that much above average. We have a lot of water vapor availability in the atmosphere, a lot of low-level humidity with higher dew points. So that does cut back on moisture stress in corn and beans. But talking with farmers and producers across the state, we've also had lots of heavy dew in the morning, which is a good signal for moisture availability. Looking out into the middle of July, we are seeing a signal for near normal to slightly cooler temperatures, but also that wet signal does continue to hold true. So if we were looking at the law of averages with a wet start to July, given the final outlook for July showing a dry signal, that suggests that the second half of July could be drier than normal. We're not seeing that right now, but if we chat next week, we could have an update on the potential for the end of July.
Justin, I'm going to wrap up our conversation with a smaller question, and then I'm going to ask a bigger question. First question, though, very simple. We just passed the halfway point of the year. Let's do a quick update on what we're seeing from the global climate patterns that we are noticing. What are we looking at here for the rest of 2025?
Yep. So if we look at the dominant climate drivers, or those teleconnections that we talk about ever so often, El Nino and La Nina typically is one of the dominant climate signals in the Pacific, and flow across the mid-latitudes where we live is west to east. So we're very cognizant of what's going on in the Pacific. We're currently in ENSO neutral conditions, and ENSO is an acronym for El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is a multi-decadal or very large-scale climate driver in the Pacific Basin. Neutral means we're in between, so in between El Nino and La Nina. So we have near normal sea surface temperatures in the Pacific. So the atmosphere decouples or doesn't respond to the oceanic behavior. And that's, getting into the growing season. The phase of El Nino or La Nina really has a low correlation with weather patterns because they're more thunderstorm driven. Now, if we're looking through the second half of 2025, it's looking like those ENSO neutral conditions will hold on into fall and winter. Higher probabilities of ENSO neutral. As we get into the cooler part of the year, that's where larger scale low pressure systems and high pressure systems as well dominate our weather pattern, and they have a higher correlation to the phase of El Nino and La Nina. Well, in the lack of those two phases and staying in ENSO neutral conditions, we fall back on recent trends, and by recent I mean the last 10 to 15 years, but also look at analog years in which we've seen ENSO neutral conditions going into fall and winter. And that'll give us a better idea of the large scale setup in the atmosphere across the northern hemisphere and any impacts that are potentially seen for harvest in getting into wintertime. So to be determined on larger scale behavior as we get into fall and winter. But as we end summer, we'll have a better idea of what the fall and winter time could bring us.
All right, Justin, now for the bigger question. July 3rd, in addition to being over halfway through the year, July 3rd marked the official day where we are now closer to 2050 than we are to 2000. It is 8,949 days from December 31st, 2000 to July 3rd, and then it'll be another 8,949 days to January 1st, 2050. So with that in mind, we're now closer to 2050. I probably could have just said that instead of going into the explanation, but we're now closer to 2050. What are we looking at for the next 25 years in weather patterns, and what are meteorologists and climatologists really anticipating across the world, across the country?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me get my crystal ball out and look 25 years
Good.
into the future.
We know Justin has his crystal ball. That's why I asked you specifically this question.
Yeah. No, I heard that fact last week, and I used it on a podcast that I tape with Dan Filius, who's in ISU Extension.
Oh, really?
Called
What's that? You'll have to tell me about that podcast too, so I can give it a shout out.
Yeah, it's called What in the Weather. So, yeah, the next 25 years, extreme events. We're seeing extreme events more often, and they're more extreme. Colder colds, warmer warms, wetter wets, and drier dries. So we're anticipating that we're going to see more extreme events. And we often get asked, given the August 10th, 2020 derecho, which we're coming up on 5-year anniversary, are we seeing more derecho events? Are we seeing more straight line events? We're definitely seeing trends for more wind events and more hail events. And we're seeing a shift in tornadic activity further south and east. These are the trends that we monitor, and these are the trends that we can project out using climate models for the next 20, 30, 40, 50 years, even towards the end of the 2100. So the trends that are most important to me are the trends that impact agriculture and our producers across the state. Corn and beans, cattle, pigs. You look at the last century and 50 years before that, getting into the 1800s, we were growing wheat across Iowa. Now we grow corn and beans. So we're going to see an increase in yields, definitely, given the hybridization that we're seeing with our seed companies, but also the impacts of wetter conditions. A warmer atmosphere holds more water vapor, but to produce a meteorological event with more water vapor in the atmosphere takes more forcing. So we talked about this earlier in the interview, and that we're seeing higher intensity events more often. These are projected to occur out in the future. So what I'm anticipating is something that we saw in 2018, 2019, the two wettest years on record. Record wetness across the northern third of the state, D3 drought conditions across parts of southern Iowa. You would only have to move north or south 4 or 5 counties to be in one extreme or the other. So a co-location of extreme events as well. Also, winter is our fastest warming season, less snowfall, more liquid and mixed precipitation in winter. So these are the trends that we are monitoring as climatologists and meteorologists in the Midwest and across the United States as well. Just seeing the epic amount of flooding in Texas and the loss of life, these really draw your attention to these extreme events. So I think the extremes are really what are going to be driving our weather and climate discussions as we move over the next several decades.
Justin Glisan, our state climatologist here in Iowa, really grateful for your time and analysis of weather-related events across the country. Thank you so much for being here on Farm Year Daily.
Thanks, David. Always a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Justin. This is Farm Year Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Thank you all for listening. Again, in order to continue to produce this type of local content, we would love to have you join our community. So please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward Pod. You can also find me on social media at Geiger Reports, as well as WHO TV Channel 13 every weekday in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger, and I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.